This is the Vanguard interview series, and I'm your host, Gavin Miller Broomfield. On the Vanguard YouTube channel, we've been talking to activists, candidates, politicians, anyone outside of the political mainstream fighting to reform our broken, corrupt political system. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Today's a special episode. We're welcoming Jerome Segal, presidential candidate of the Bread and Roses Party. How's it going today, Jerome?
Very good, thanks.
Cool. Well, with all this craziness happening in the last week or so with the passing of, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I just wanted to get your perspective on what the hell is happening in America right now. What do you think is going on? And are you optimistic about the future of the Supreme Court?
Well, there's so much going on in so many different dimensions, but I think the most serious thing that's going on, I think, is that Trump is systematically destroying the whole framework of American democracy. There's nothing more fundamental to this country than the decision that we make as to who governs.
Mm-hmm.
And we make that decision through our elections. And this guy is systematically both undermining people's confidence in that system and actively participating in an effort to destroy the mechanisms whereby we could even register what our will is as to who governs us.
Mm-hmm.
Once you do that, it's not the same country. It really is. It really is the end of, if he carries this off, it's really the end of the country that we've been in since the Constitution was written, and we're then, in something new that's not the United States. And what's astonishing about this is that it's not being done in secret. It's being done in full view. It's totally exposed. And what's more extraordinary than Trump is that the Republicans who hold power in the Senate and elsewhere, but primarily in the Congress, can witness this and just simply allow it to happen. And it's so different than, this being about some issue, that we have this position and that position, and it's a hard fight, and, and so on and so on. This is so different. This is actually someone taking a torch to the entire system and being aided and abetted by people who have spent their whole life, their entire life, working inside of that system. And so, it's just astounding. I mean, it's something that you simply would not have believed is possible. I mean, there's so many things that have happened, of course, with the Trump administration that no one would have believed was possible. But this is of a different order.
Agreed.
This is really of a different order than anything we've seen before.
Agreed. I mean, I try to resist a little bit in my own mind this kind of thought that the Democrats put out there that, Trump is this unique evil and that he's this, uncommon evil and all this stuff, because it kind of just seems like alarmist rhetoric you hear around the time of election season, right? But then Trump, over and over again goes out there and gives them complete validation to go with that line of attack on him. And he, totally validates the fact that this election really is a referendum kind of on authoritarianism, on fascism. Because he repeatedly says that, we're not going to, count the mail-in vote ballots. We're not going to accept the results after the November 3rd night, this kind of thing. So, yeah, I do agree with you, despite wanting to stay calm and not, give in to the whole the world is ending ideology. I do see what you're saying, and I do think that Trump is giving people actual, reason to believe that.
And it's going to get worse. I mean, this will probably continue. Not just to the election. What we're talking about is a process that's that, I don't even know if it'll be resolved January 21st,
Right.
but it looks like we're really into, whatever that is, another, 5 months of a horror story that every day seems to, break new ground. So, I mean, it's really just, it's beyond belief. And the thing is that, it's not, I mean, yes, Trump is unique in all sorts of ways, but for all we know, there could have been a dozen presidents who, if they could get away with it, would have done things like him, like Nixon, as an
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
and so on. But the point is that up until now, we had a system that held these people in check. I mean, Nixon was willing to authorize, criminal break-ins
Yeah.
in order to, get evidence on his opponents or to, undermine critics and so on. So he was willing to, to actually commit essentially felonies in order to pursue his stuff. But the point is, he wasn't able to carry it out, or he wasn't able to get away with it,
Right.
and a lot of the resistance ultimately, it came from his own party and a willingness to impeach him. And ultimately, he resigned because he was told
Yeah.
that if this goes to a vote in the
You're
Senate,
out of
your
here.
impeachment will actually, you'll be found guilty. And so he had no choice. And so that is so different from, from where we are.
Right.
And that's the most remarkable things, because, what we see from Trump is of course, a totally horrific human being with incredible power. But, you know, just by happenstance, that may happen every once in a while. What doesn't happen is that they can get away with it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what's really, I mean,
Well,
just
and the media does us no service, the American people, by constantly going after this narrative of the anti-Trump Republican, kind of these Mitt Romney type mythical Republicans that are supposedly better than the Trumpists, and they're the ones that actually wanted to restore democracy. So it kind of shifts the complacency, or the complicity from just Trump away from all of the Republicans, when in
Well, I
reality
think
they've
that,
been.
yeah, I would say one thing, though. I think that Mitt Romney is a category all by himself. And the reason is that Romney voted to impeach.
Sure. But
See,
that was
so,
a more symbolic thing. When it comes to like the Supreme Court justice, where it actually matters, he's proving that he's going to fall in line and
right, but the
vote with
Supreme
the.
Court justice, but that's not the same order of issue that we're talking about. I mean, that we can talk about that case, and it's
Yeah.
a very, I think it is kind of complex, the rights and wrongs with it and so on. But, the question about impeachment, I mean, the truth of the matter is that, the Democrats could impeach him again,
Yeah.
and maybe they should, in the House. And it'll be very interesting. I mean, that may actually, now that I think about it, that may be, if this gets worse, that may be the way out of this, is to impeach him and then to see if, you can get a bunch of people to join Romney and actually take him out of office through the Senate. Because, and I'm not sure, I mean, do you need, for him to be convicted in the Senate, do you need a 2/3 majority of the Senate, or a majority? Maybe you need 2/3. I'm not
If
sure.
it's 2/3, I think it might be 2/3, in which case there's absolutely no chance.
Right. But nonetheless,
Yeah.
the votes will start to shift, and it'll be very interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
if it was done again, it'll be very interesting to see whether or not you could at least get a majority. And for
Yeah.
that, you'd have to add, I think, 3 people to Romney,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that I think is doable, depending on how this plays out.
I mean, it's possible. I just can't see someone like Mitt Romney or one of these other senators taking a stand there when they wouldn't with the Supreme Court thing. Because, I mean, obviously,
Oh,
I know Mitt or he voted to impeach the first time around, but I think he kind of knew that there wasn't any real chance that it would make it through the Senate. So it would be interesting to see, the
yeah,
actual
but he took
courage of
the
these.
political heat for doing that,
Yeah.
one way or the other. Um, no, I see that. I mean, we can talk about the Supreme Court if you want, but I mean, um, I see that as a very different, um, issue. The most dramatic thing about it that strikes, I think is of course the hypocrisy and the double standard. So, but if you took the double standard out of this question and you just asked straight out, let's say there wasn't a question of the Republicans, having refused to give Garland
Yeah.
the hearing and the vote and so
Yeah.
on, and this just came up, and you said, well, is there something inherently monstrous about the idea that in a few weeks before the election or in the 4 months after an election, that a sitting president would use the powers of his office to name a justice of the Supreme Court? I would say no. I mean, I would say, that's just the way the Constitution works, and it's our bad luck that
Yeah.
it turns out to be, Trump who's the president and a right-wing justice that'll be, but let's face it. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg didn't retire because Trump won, and she didn't want to give him a chance to put in a right winger, and good for her. And it's bad luck that her disease has caught up with her just at the last moment. But it's their good luck, and so the fact that they would take advantage of it wouldn't be particularly shocking. And
Yeah.
since it's allowed under the Constitution, it wouldn't be particularly egregious. What makes it outrageous is the fact that they didn't let Obama have his appointment.
I know.
But that's that's kind of, that's just kind of coarse hypocrisy and double standard and so on. That's not the same thing as destroying the institutions that have
Sure.
are at the essence.
I agree with that. I think that a lot of people, including myself, are just kind of exhausted watching the GOP play hardball against the left, where the Democrats never fight back in a serious way. Like, I mean, if they were a serious opposition, I feel like they would just be doing everything possible to stop this president from appointing that Supreme Court justice. I mean, they've gone on and on about how he's an illegitimate Russian puppet and how he's, didn't win the popular vote. He's not a legitimate president, certainly not by my definition, but definitely not by their definition. So to think that they would just roll over and let him appoint RBG's replacement when there's 2 or 3 or 4 weeks.
Why do you say roll over? What is it that people could do that would, for instance, let's take the Supreme Court thing.
Yeah.
What if you're a member of Congress? I mean, there are things that people could do in the street. I don't think they'd be effective, but if you're a member of Congress, what could you do to actually successfully block the appointment of a right-wing justice?
I mean, I'm not a senator or a congressperson. I don't know the specifics, but I do know there are specific things. Like one senator can basically stop an entire vote from occurring. So if each Democratic senator,
that's the filibuster. But the point is that you can override that filibuster, and they have the power in the Senate to do that, because now you only need a majority vote on these judicial appointments to be able to prevent that. So it used to be the case, if I understand it correctly, that essentially because of the filibuster, in effect, you needed 60 senators to successfully confirm Supreme Court nomination. But what happened, and to some extent, actually, I think Harry Reid contributed to this when the Democrats had control of the Senate, they weakened that constraint so that now a simple majority of 50 Republicans is enough, to have the vote.
Yeah.
And so we got, 2 senators. I was surprised. I thought maybe we would get this time 4 senators who would refuse to hear it. They got 2, and it doesn't look like they can get another 2. I mean, but you were saying that, you think that there are things that the Democrats could do that they're not doing. I think they're doing everything they can, and in fact, they're threatening. One of the things that they are doing that may be reckless is to threaten what they will do if, in fact, it turns out that they win the Senate next time.
Which
First
is to
of
pack
all,
the court.
you shouldn't threaten as to what you'll do if you have power that you don't have. That's not a good idea, because you may not win the Senate, and you'll be there then with having raised possible
Yeah,
courses of action.
I understand what you mean. Uh,
So I mean,
Although it
I
would give
think,
people like me a reason to vote for them, if they were actually showing some backbone and saying, "Hey, we're going to either stack or abolish the Supreme Court altogether," that would give me a real reason to go out there and be enthusiastic about voting for
well, they
them.
don't
But
have
I
the
see what you're
power to.
saying.
The point is, they don't have the power to do any of this. The only thing that will change that, um, is winning the Senate.
Well, that's what I mean. It would help. It would help give them more enthusiastic people to vote for
Yeah,
them.
well, I think that, yeah. I mean, let me put it this way. I'm going back to sort of my candidacy. So
Yeah, let's get into that. By the way,
you know,
sorry about
so
that. Didn't mean to get
I'm
sidetracked.
I'm running on this, for president. I've got a
Hmm.
running mate, John DeGraff, who's a well-known writer and filmmaker, and we started a new party called Bread and Roses. Um, and unlike, um, let's say, the Green Party as an
Hmm.
example, but almost all of the third parties, actually, we view Trump as such an evil that we very much want Biden to win.
Yeah, that's
And
fair.
because of that, I didn't seek ballot access in any of the swing states. And in the states where I'm on the ballot, which unfortunately is just in Maryland and Vermont,
Hmm.
um, I've pledged that, if Joe Biden's lead before the election ever falls below 10 points, I'll drop out of the race, because uh, I think that, the number one objective for all of us really should be getting rid of Trump. And the last thing that I think third parties should do, even no matter how deep our objection is to the Democrats and the Republicans, is take any chance that our own candidacies will turn out to be, um, the unfortunate
Successful.
thing that
Yeah.
makes a Trump victory possible.
Right.
So,
I understand what you're saying. Yeah, for
so
sure.
that's sort of where we're at. And well, why don't I could go on for a long time, but why don't I respond to questions
Yeah,
about the
absolutely.
candidacy, about the party?
Yeah, well, that's interesting strategically that you point that out that, you are running for president, but you really are hoping that Biden wins the presidency. And of course, you're, like you said, promising to drop out even if he falls below a certain polling threshold. So what would you say is the purpose of your candidacy? What are you hoping to accomplish with this run for
Yeah,
president?
well, you see, an awful lot, I think, changed, because of Bernie Sanders,
Hmm.
um, in 2016 and in the intervening years, and now this year. And I think what Bernie did, is, first of all, he demonstrated that, um, all sorts of things are possible inside the Democratic Party that we didn't think was possible, and I don't think was possible previous to Bernie. I don't think it was just that he, knew a reality and demonstrated it. I think he actually successfully built a movement that empowered a huge chunk of people inside the party.
Yeah,
And I actually think that if it wasn't for the question of who could beat Trump, I think actually the main reason that Biden won
agreed.
is that it was not because people were
Yeah,
more enthusiastic about him than Elizabeth Warren or Bernie,
yeah,
but because they reached this conclusion that he was the most likely person to beat Trump. And I think that people disagree whether or not that was a right conclusion or not. I tended to, no, we don't have a crystal ball, but I think it was a reasonable conclusion, and so far so good as far as the polls are concerned. We'll
I
see.
disagree with
People
that,
disagree with
but
that. I
yeah,
understand. I understand that. But in terms of the meaning that has for me,
yeah,
okay, what it means is that, we don't see, the Republicans and the Democrats, um, as basically, um, two choices between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. In other words, not two identical parties. I think there are very real differences. And I actually think that I'm arguing, Bread and Roses. Let me give you just a rough sense of what our platform is. Okay, so bread really has to do with the material dimensions of life. It has to do with very much with people's income, with whether or not they're employed, with whether or not they have health insurance, and all sorts of fundamental issues that were raised in the Democratic primaries, and our position on those issues um, is yeah, that's where it is in some detail. And if one reads through it, you'll see that there's enormous overlap in here between the perspectives that Bernie put forward, and to some extent Elizabeth, and then others. And and I came to these things. I've been active since the '60s in one form or another. And just to give you, a bit about my background. So, I started out as well. I was actually on the University of Michigan campus during the first teach-ins, and that's really what the radicalizing experience was sort of the anti-war activity, and then I got into civil rights issues, and then education reform, and so on.
You've been
But
at this for a while.
basically, I left the academic world, got a second degree in public affairs, and came to Washington to work for the Congress in 1975, right? And I founded, when I came here, something called the Congressional Staff Caucus.
Mm.
And the defining credo that we had was that we were interested in the redistribution of income, wealth, and power in the United States, right? And at that time, we found we were about 50 people who were all legislative aides working for the Congress, all of us a bit astonished to find that we had these jobs, because we were all, in the decade before, had been marching in one protest after another, and 10 years had gone by, and we were a small group of people. But Bernie wasn't on the Hill, and he wasn't a staff person, but he made the same decision, basically coming from the same place, to go into electoral politics.
Yeah.
He went in as a candidate,
Yeah.
and the 50 of us who formed this Congressional Staff Caucus came to Washington to work inside the system for the best people in Congress that we could get jobs with. So that's sort of where I started in Washington.
And what kind of perspective did that give you?
45 years ago. That was 45 years ago. What was your question? What perspective?
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say, what did you see there?
It's very interesting because nobody, so I said income, wealth, and power, right? Nobody was, everyone, if they talked about distribution, it was distribution of income. Nobody talked about distribution of wealth in 1975. And in fact, 2 years later, the congressman that I was working for was named to be a member of the House Budget Committee. And working with him, we established on the House Budget Committee a task force that he became the chairman of, and I became the administrator of, that never existed before. And then when he left the Congress, it went out of existence. But for the short time that it was there, it was called the Task Force on the Distributive Impacts of Budget and Economic Policy. And what that meant is that we could look at and hold hearings, and we did, hold hearings on any piece of legislation that was before the Congress, and ask basically who benefits from this and who bears the burden of this and there was no systematic place on the Hill for anyone to look at legislation from that point of view. And in that capacity, we held the first hearings that had ever occurred, and I think maybe the last actually, but certainly the first, on the maldistribution of wealth in the United States. So this was in, I think in 1978 or 79, right? And then I wrote a report on these hearings on the distribution of wealth. So, when I talk about distribution of wealth and bread and roses and so on, it's not that I've sort of, oh yeah, last year I picked up on, on Bernie's program. Like Bernie, I'm the same age as him, and we come from the same place, and we both come from New York City, and we're both Jewish, and he grew up in Brooklyn, and I grew up in the Bronx, and so on. But there's a lot of overlap in terms of who we are, where we're coming from, and in terms of the trajectories that we took, going from protest to an
Yeah.
engagement in the electoral sphere. So, and I wrote a report at that time for this subcommittee on an issue that is central to Bread and Roses and my campaign, which really isn't very much talked about on the left. And it had to do with the distribution of the pattern of unemployment,
Mm.
right? And so the point is that if you look at unemployment statistics in the worst recession, right? And, let's say when the unemployment, is 10%, okay? If you look at, well, how does unemployment affect different segments of the society? Even at that worst recession, if you look at white collar professionals, you'll see that their unemployment rate in the depths of a recession is probably around 3%.
Yeah.
And if you look at lawyers, you'll see that in the worst of times, it's never more than 2% of lawyers are out of work. And those 2% are out of work basically because they're in between jobs,
Yeah.
moving around. But if you look at, say, Black adults, blue collar workers, and so on, you'll find that their unemployment rate might be 15%.
Yeah.
So you've got this incredible disparity of unemployment. And you have it right now with the pandemic, right? Okay, but here's the question. Why are these people unemployed, right? And there are many different reasons, okay? And some of it has to do with, deep structural issues, whether it's institutional racism or it's basically, structural poverty passing from generation to generation, and that people just don't start out, on an equal footing, and it builds into all sorts of things that make one person vulnerable and so on. But sometimes it's much more than that. Sometimes, like with the pandemic, people are unemployed because the society
Mm-hmm.
introduced a public policy that deliberately closed down the economy in order to serve an important general, in this case, public health purpose. And it was a good purpose. And the policy of closing down the economy, I think, was necessary, okay? But why in the world is it fair for the burden of closing down the economy to beat the pandemic to fall on, the most vulnerable people in the society, and for white professionals to go with their situation unchanged, except for the fact that now we work from home rather than from the office? So it's a staggering injustice that decides that we all need this massive policy, but the burden of it is going to fall on this small group of
Yep.
people.
Yep.
Well, then if you pull back and you say, well, what about in the normal times? And this is what I wrote about in one of these reports when I was on the Hill. I said, well, it's also the case that we have a lot of unemployment that's deliberately caused by the government, and in particular by the Federal Reserve when it raises interest rates. And it raises interest rates. Why does it raise interest rates? It raises interest rates because it's afraid that the economy is overheating. But what that really means, what are they afraid of? What they're afraid of is inflation,
Mm-hmm.
right? And nobody likes inflation. And the mission of the Federal Reserve, its original mission, was stable prices, which is a very desirable objective. Everybody hates it, and it can get quite horrible if you get really runaway inflation. So the Fed has the power to raise interest rates, cool down the economy, which means deliberately putting people out of work in order to control prices. Very good objective, very good, maybe not so good, but a policy choice that you can understand. But again, why should, one small group of people in the society bear the cost of getting stable prices? After all, there are other ways to get stable prices that don't hit one. You can have stable prices by having very severe wage and price controls like we had during World War II. In World War II, we had inflation of about 1%, and we had unemployment at about 2%. We had a hotter economy than we've ever had in the history of the country, and stable prices because we made it illegal to raise prices. So you can do it.
Oh,
But
yeah.
for a variety of reasons, some having to do with, efficiency and blah, 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 and markets and so on, the decision is we don't want to do it that way except in a real emergency. Okay, fair enough. But don't have the burden of that
Yep.
fall on us. So how do you spread the burden? And here's where we put forward a policy for that, okay? We put forward a policy that essentially is job sharing. So it says, look, if you've got 10% unemployment, right? What it means is 90% of your people in your workforce are working and 10% are not working. Another way of looking at that is to say that the aggregate demand in the economy is only requiring 90% of the workforce, okay? So, but if you've got aggregate demand for 90%, there are two ways of fulfilling it. You can have 90% working full-time and 10% out of work, or you could have 100% working 90% of the time. In other words, everybody could be working, but working 36 hours rather than 40 hours, and you'd have everybody having a job, but having 4 hours less of work. And our view actually is that even if, and you wouldn't even have to have a 10% cut of pay, because you could even supplement it with what you're saving on unemployment benefits and all the rest of it. But the point is, even if everybody had to take a 10% pay reduction in exchange for having, a shorter work week, a lot of people would actually decide, hey, we're actually better off. We don't need all of that money. In fact, a
Yep.
lot of the reason why we're pursuing more money is because we're trying to keep up with the other guy in terms of consumption.
Yep.
If all of us agreed on 10% less money and a shorter work week, we'd all be happier. And that's where the roses part comes in. Because
Right.
what roses is about is a different American dream. And one part of it is basically having modest income, not higher income, modest income, but much higher security. And just because income is modest, having more leisure time. In other words, reducing the work week back on the labor agenda. So if you go back into the history of labor, right, in the 19th century and the early 20th century, it wasn't just higher wages. It was higher wages and a shorter workday and a shorter work week. And the labor movement was very successful, right? People used to work 12 days, to work 14 hours a day, We
Yeah.
got to 12 hours, we got it down to 10. Ultimately, we got it down to 8. And, Keynes, actually, John Maynard Keynes, writing, I think it was in the 30s or the 20s, he prophesized
Yep.
that in 100 years, people would be working 15 hours
15. Yeah.
a
We
week,
wrote a piece about that at
and
our
so
blog,
on,
at the Vanguard blog.
and
Right.
and it hasn't happened. What happened
Yep.
was that once we got down to the 40-hour work week, we never went below that, even though in the 1930s, there was legislation, and I think it passed the House and failed in the Senate, or the other way around. But in the 30s, there was legislation to bring the work week down to 32 hours a week. And that was the last time that reducing work time was ever on the agenda. But what happened actually is that because, the formal workplace opened up for women, right? We had on the household level, rather than the old pattern, which was, the guy worked
Yep.
and the mother stayed home, and the household basically left the house for 40 hours a week. Okay, so now what we have in terms of family life is dual career families, which is a good thing. But what's not a good thing is that they have two 40-hour jobs.
Exactly. Exactly.
And if we had a choice, if Americans had a choice of, do we want to go, we're going to move. Let's say we're going to move from one person in the formal workforce at 40 hours a week. We're
Yeah.
going to move to 2. Now we have got a choice. Do we want to do it at 2 at 30 hours a week each, or do we want to do it at 2 at 40 hours a week each, right? I am positive that if that had ever been a choice, overwhelmingly, Americans would have said, oh, no, my God, 2 people working, 30 hours is certainly preferable to 2 doing 40. And probably a better thing is actually having 2 working 25.
Yeah.
2 working, it's still a 50, which is more than 40, so there'd be
Agreed.
more income.
Yeah.
And so, but one of the things about our society is that certain kinds of very, very basic choices never get made. They just happen.
Yeah.
So these things were never on the agenda. So part of what Bread and Roses is about is to highlight these kind of fundamentals, which really have to do with the question that we raised called, what is an economy for anyway?
Yeah.
which is also
Well,
the name of a
I
book
was
that,
reading your website and literature a little bit, and it mentioned that the Bread and Roses Party identifies itself as socialistic in nature, but distinguishing itself from traditional socialism. And it says that the party advocates socialist ideals such as for each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. Can you just explain a little bit more how this vision of socialism, is in contrast with that of other visions out there, including that of Senator
yeah, well,
Sanders?
so yeah, there are certain elements of the socialist tradition that uh, that 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 we embrace and interpret maybe in our own ways and so on. Um, some of them have to do actually with the ethical dimensions of socialism, or the value base, or what is the goal, or ultimately what is the good society and what is the
Mhm.
just society. Then there are issues. So there are questions about ends
Yeah.
in many ways as distinct from questions about means. A lot of people identify socialism in terms of its means, like, oh, socialism means ownership of capital, okay, by the people or by the government or whatever, nationalization and all this stuff. But the point is that there was never a socialist, as far as I know, in history, who understood what he was about in terms of means. What socialism has been about most fundamentally is concepts of justice and concept of a good society, and then it got associated with certain ways of doing it, which became part of the definition. But the most fundamental thing is not the means for doing something; it's what you're trying to accomplish. Now, the deepest criticism of capitalism, um, in my judgment, in the socialist tradition, is found in the writings of Marx, but in what's referred to as uh, the economic and philosophical manuscripts. That is the early Marx, right? And he wrote these incredible manuscripts. One is on alienated labor, and another one is about money. But the one on alienated labor is particularly essential. And by alienated, by the way, he means, to some extent, there's the psychological sense of alienation, of not doing labor that or work that feels
Yeah.
like your own, right? But for Marx, actually, he means that. He actually talks about it in a very sophisticated way in terms of like 5 or 6 dimensions of alienation. But the most fundamental definition of alienation um, is alienation used as a synonym for the verb to sell. Okay, so when we talk about certain rights as being unalienable or inalienable rights,
Yeah.
what we mean is that you can't give them away, you
Right.
can't sell them. In other words, you can't be sold into slavery, right? It's illegal to even sell them, even if you have those rights, they're yours, but no one can take them away from you, even in exchange for money. They're inalienable. They're just simply not for sale, okay? So, but when Marx talks about capitalism, he's talking about the alienation of labor, meaning the sale of your labor or your labor time, right? And that is something that's very specific to capitalism,
Yeah.
okay? Because capitalism is, right? It's a mode of production or a mode of productive activity
Yeah.
in which basically something different happened in human history, which is we always had markets, we always had, private interest, and we always had exchange, okay? But what capitalism is a mode of production such as the tools for making things changed from being tools that a worker or a master, could own in a small shop, and someone could be an apprentice and ultimately come to own the tools of being a carpenter, or being a plumber, or being a shoemaker, or a weaver, and so on. In capitalism, what happened is that the mode of production got so enormous that the tools needed to make anything were no longer owned by a small shop,
Yeah.
but they became these giant engines of mass production.
Right.
And so no workers could ever own the tools that you needed, say, to make an automobile. To
Right.
make an automobile, what you had to do was sell your labor, or to get a job making an automobile, you had to sell your labor to the corporation that
Yeah.
owned these giant factories. And so what happened, and that was the defining thing about capitalism, is that workers then put themselves, but essentially put their labor time on the market. Now, another way of talking about that we use, and I took this from a philosopher who was actually my thesis advisor when I was at Michigan, a guy named Fritjof Bergman, is that he calls that the job system. And we take it for granted, right? The job system is, it's like it's all around us, but the job system is basically a world in which there are a few people or a few entities that are the so-called job creators.
Yeah.
Right? And then everybody else is a job holder, a job seeker, a job aspirant, or a
Yep.
student trying to contort themselves into being a successful job seeker at some time in the future, okay? But this whole idea that of the job system is something that is not a fact of nature, something
Yep.
that never existed in human history until maybe about 150 years ago. And now, even in some parts of the world, it's not dominant.
Yeah.
But in the United States and the entire industrial world and so on, it has been overwhelmingly dominant. And part of what Bread and Roses is about is getting rid of the job system or overcoming the job system. Okay, and so we've got our central economic policy. But you asked me, how does this link to socialism? Okay, what I'm saying is that what we're going after is this very, very fundamental critique of capitalism as being this arena in which you sell your labor, and because you sell your labor, of course, you become, in Marxist terms, alienated from yourself, and your
Well,
labor no longer reflects who you are. It no longer becomes meaningful labor.
I agree with that. And I wanted to, oh, sorry.
Let me just say one thing, and I won't go into it.
You're good.
But so not only do what Bread and Roses is about, and here's where we differ from a lot of other third parties, right? A lot of parties identify themselves. You can have a checklist of all the things to be for and against that came up in all the debates and all the time and so on. Okay. Then, depending on how you fill out those blanks, a party gets a specific identity or a candidate gets a specific identity. He's for this, he's against that, and so on. Okay. The primary thing that we're about is, first of all, putting new things on that checklist, putting on that checklist issues that never came up in the town hall debates. So, for instance, like, what is the American dream? What is an economy for? So that's one of the things that makes us different, is that we're trying to broaden the discourse, deepen the discourse, and have new issues out there. The second thing that we do is that we do policy development. So we try to develop new policy ideas for addressing these deep questions that often aren't even raised by others. And in this particular case, what we've put forward, and I'm not even sure if it's on the website, but I've written about it, and I may have something posted on Medium, but maybe not. Anyway, what we have is something that I'm calling guaranteed basic employment.
Okay.
And guaranteed basic employment is very much what I was talking about before, about spreading the burden of unemployment. It's a form of job guarantee, where it's a federal job guarantee that the federal government would guarantee what we call basic employment. And that differs from the proposal for federal job guarantee has come up every once in a while since actually Roosevelt talked about it. And it came up in the 70s. There was a black congressman named Gus Hawkins, and something that was called the Humphrey Hawkins bill, that the original form would have created. It passed the Congress, but they took out the jobs guarantee in it. And Jesse Jackson talked about it. And Bernie Sanders even endorsed the idea of a jobs guarantee.
He did.
And unfortunately, if it was up to me, I would have had that been the centerpiece.
That's interesting.
Of Sanders' campaign, rather than the
Medicare for all.
Medicare for all.
Yeah.
It's much more fundamental, the jobs guarantee. But what we're talking about is a different kind of jobs guarantee. We're talking about guaranteeing what I call basic employment, right? Now, by basic employment, what we mean is 20 hours a week. Guarantee that everyone can have 20 hours a week, and then set within a matrix of other policies that will guarantee that 20 hours a week is sufficient to meet your basic economic needs. And so those policies So it's a guarantee of 20 hours set within a set of other policies. And the other policies actually are relatively commonplace,
Yeah.
but taken together, they create something totally new. So it's a $15 minimum wage. It's free higher education. It's caps on spending for childcare no more than 10% of your income, a cap on healthcare spending that's no more than 10% of your income, and it's tax elimination, which isn't in the progressive thing, but it's one thing that we're providing,
Yeah.
which
Well,
is
this
tax
is
elimination for anyone making under, it turns out a specific number, $15,100, but that's basically the salary that you could make at $15 an hour at 20. So anybody who has this jobs guarantee will pay no taxes at all, not just no income tax, but no Social Security tax.
well,
And
that's
then we also have an increment in the earned income tax credit. So none of these actually are radical, but you put all of these together, and what you have is a situation in which a household with two wage earners could have two people each working
yeah.
20 hours a week
I understand
and
with the
have the
plan.
consumption level that today you'd have to earn
Yes.
$60,000 a year for.
Yes.
So this
Well,
is
this kind of goes
transformative.
into, the conversation which we've been having on the left recently about, kind of the jobs guarantee model versus the basic income model, which was
Right.
really broached in the primary. Someone like Andrew Yang came along and introduced this
Yes.
idea of a universal basic income, which it reminds me when you were speaking earlier, you said like, as the economy, as industry has evolved, it used to just be, the owners of the shop could, own the tools to make the car, to knit the shirt or whatever. But as industry has progressed now, the tools are bigger and they have to be afforded by these corporations, and these
Yeah.
corporations employ people. Well, this of course leads to the inevitability of automation, which is of course taking over increasingly more and more of industry, more and more of the workplace, and displacing more and more people from their jobs. So and you talk about a federal jobs guarantee essentially, which I agree is a great idea, and which I agree is the kind of fundamental reform we need to bring democracy more into people's lives. But I also do think that there's a serious place here for a universal basic income, because I mean, you talk about the issue of jobs and how like that's this ridiculous exploitative factor that is not necessarily even a natural aspect of human life. But a federal basic income would basically ensure people a standard of life without even having to, in exchange for labor, it just affords them that as a basic guarantee.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's a
Yeah. I'm not a, there's one element when I talked about inside a matrix of policy. Okay. There's one element in there that, and I talk about this. I have a book that I wrote called Graceful Simplicity, The Philosophy and Politics of the Alternative American Dream. And what I talk about, actually, a lot of what's in there are the fundamentals of this bread and roses agenda.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I talk about in there that's part of this, what we're now calling the guaranteed basic employment, is an increase in the earned income tax credit,
Okay.
which a lot of people aren't very familiar with, but actually is a part of existing law, and actually is very similar to basic income,
Mhm.
because what the earned income tax credit is actually the government writing checks to people to give them higher levels of income in order to cover their ability to make basic
Yeah.
needs. The difference is that the earned income tax credit, first of all, it's very targeted. So it goes to people on the basis of need.
Yeah.
Andrew Young's thing was, a flat $12,000, to every adult in the society, whether you needed more than
Right.
$12,000 or you didn't need a penny of
Well,
it,
just like
you
Social
all got the
Security.
same thing, right?
Just like Social Security.
Well, no, Social Security depends on how much you put in. So some people
That
get,
is true. Well, that's true. I just meant in
and
the fact
also
that it's
what
a
you charge.
universal program. It's a universal
Social,
program like Medicare or
yeah, well,
Social
this could be a
Security.
universal program also, but it could
Yeah.
also phase out so that, why in the world, because we've got limited dollars, right? And the more money you give to people at the top, the less money there is to give to people at the bottom. And we also have limited political capital. So it may be the case, the price tag for doing Andrew Young's proposal is a staggering, it's like $2.8 trillion
Well, his
a
idea was to
year.
tax the automation industry, essentially. So basically, the people would also be reaping the profits of the automation industry, not just the people at the very top of the corporations.
Yeah,
So
well,
basically,
I mean, actually, we have a different with I might be. I'll tell you. Let me get to automation in a second, okay? But let me just say one thing I want to say, which is just it just has to do with power. I mean, you can have fantasies, okay? You can have fantasies that that you know not the Democrats win, but that Bren Roses wins the presidency and the Congress, and and so on. And we can do anything that we want, and we can actually close all the loopholes. We can prevent a flight of capital overseas. We can we can do have our wish list. Okay, so we could in fact institute a gigantic transfer of wealth and income from the top to the bottom. Okay, and for instance, we could now just put this in perspective. Okay, the total amount of money that the federal government raises each year from the income tax is somewhere around $2 trillion a year. I think it's 1.8 trillion a year. Okay, so in this fantasy, you could say, well, why don't we double the federal income tax from 2 trillion a year to $4 trillion a year, but we'll take that whole second trillion. Let's take it just from the top 1%,
yeah.
and let's give it to everybody else in the society, okay? And we'll call it, the universal basic income, and it'll be this massive income transfer from the top 1% to everyone else, okay? So that we have fantasy. But the point is, yeah, but now let's get real. Do we have in the next 4 years, in the next 8 years, in the next 100 years, the political power to do that kind of thing? And if we don't, then maybe we should stop focusing on proposals that require that and proposals that can accomplish 90% of that, or maybe, as I would argue, 150% of that.
Well, that's
Their
interesting
objectives
because,
even better, but are totally doable.
yeah,
And
well, that's
that's
interesting.
our proposal.
A lot of people thought that Andrew Yang's proposal was the more realistic, more doable version of some of these quote unquote pie in the sky socialist ideas, because he wasn't proposing raising the federal income tax. He was proposing taxing a pre-existing industry, which is the automation industry, which is displacing American jobs as we speak. So he was just saying, instead of allowing them to profit off of that displacement of jobs, why not let the profits flow down to everyone?
Well,
So
actually,
it's not
yeah,
like destroying
I
any.
think I read Yang's book, and actually in the book, um, the tax proposal that he put forward essentially is a value added tax, which is basically a universal tax on consumption that is used in Europe and in many countries around the world, and can raise a great deal of money. But it's very much like a sales tax. In fact, it is a kind of sales tax. On automation, there's an awful lot to be said about automation, but I actually, in theory, of course, automation in principle is a very good thing.
Agreed, because then it takes the burden off human labor.
That's right.
And
That's
then
right.
we can all just get paid to do
Yeah.
nothing. That's
And
what I'm
I
saying.
wrote in my book, I wrote a little thing. I said, to put this in perspective, I said, let's ask, sort of in terms of automation, what is the worker's worst nightmare? That is, what is the worst thing that could happen to you by way of automation? And the very worst thing that could happen, right, would be for them to discover a way to make a perfect robotic duplicate of you. So it could do everything that you can do. It'll look just like you. It'll do everything you can do, but it can be produced cheaply, right?
Yeah.
And it'll do it at least as well as you can, so that no matter what job you go for, right, it'll always be the case that the job creator makes more money by just purchasing another duplicate of you to do it than you, and you can never get another job. Okay, so that's technology at its absolute worst. Now I said, take that exact technological scenario and one little change, right? What if it's the case that there is, in fact, this perfect duplicate of you, and the only difference is that you're the only person who owns that duplicate.
Yeah.
Okay. What
Yeah.
that means is that any job that you can get, you don't have to go to work any
Right.
day you want. You just send your robot. And
Right.
from the point of view of the boss, the robot is a perfect duplicate. In fact, maybe even better than you. Okay. And so you have total freedom.
Right.
Okay. Now, the point is that the technology is absolutely identical. So you've got, as it were, the worst nightmare and, the greatest dream coming both from the same technology.
It just
What's the
depends on how it's
difference?
handled.
The
Yeah.
difference is who owns the robot,
Yeah.
right? Which gets to the issue of ownership, right? And so the answer, if 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 automation is, and I'm not 100% convinced by the scenarios, but we could differ on that and so on, how fast, how serious, how complete, and so on automation even at present will be, but it doesn't matter. The point is, assuming the worst case for automation, the perfect answer to automation is change the ownership structure, give the robots to the workers. And
Yeah.
what that has to do with is democratic ownership of capital, okay? Rather than nationalization where it goes into, the hands of the government
Yeah.
as it were, democratically spread out the complete ownership of all the capital. And there are a variety of ways of doing this. You can have what people call sovereign wealth funds, where the government actually has these gigantic funds that actually go into the market and buy up the corporations and
Hmm.
own them in the name of the people. And like Sweden has that
Yeah.
kind of thing, and so on. Another alternative actually is to have a system that gradually provides for the corporate stock um, to be transferred from the few people who own it right now, to the mass of the public. And on my website, I talk about, I have that section on the home page where I talk about 10 basics. If you go to the very first basic, go past the bread and roses, go past what do we want, and right here, level the pyramid, right? In here, redistribute wealth and income, right? And part of what I'm talking about in there is multiple policies to, um, I think it's in here. But anyway, we talk about at length, basically, about policies that would make it possible for ordinary people to own 75% of the corporate stock in America.
Yeah.
And so that would be a goal, and I think it's a very doable goal. Um, and so, but the part of the going back to Yang thing is that, you see, I think the real issue um, isn't um, income. The real issue is the alienation of labor. What people need work. They need meaningful work, and they also need
But don't you
need
think that
income.
what if you're an artist? Then what if, I mean, going to some factory job for the government isn't going to be fulfilling. A
That's
universal
right.
income would better. If you're a
That's right.
filmmaker,
But what the guarantee of basic income means is that you can meet all of your needs by doing that 20 hours a week. So yes, you may be an artist, but what this means is that you can be an artist 20 hours a week right there. And if you're lucky, you'll be successful as an artist and actually be able to reduce your job system work below 20. And some people, like me, I was a philosopher, and I actually was able to work full time as a philosopher. So
hmm
some people actually in the job system can
yeah,
find a
yeah,
perfect fit
absolutely.
between what we call passion work
Yeah.
and
Well,
job system work.
I think you're absolutely correct that the policies have to kind of, come in a together, income, federal jobs guarantee, healthcare. It needs to be not just one of these is going to be enough, I don't
But
think.
here's the point, and here's where we differ from Bernie, and here's the roses, okay? See, because part of what we're saying, if you go back to, let's say, the Democratic debates, right? Now, everybody on the stage, it wasn't just Bernie and wasn't just Elizabeth Warren, everybody agreed that our economy wasn't working for the average person, okay? And what they differed about was primarily what to do about it, okay? And Bernie had a variety of solutions that pushed the envelope in directions that he called socialism. They were sort of New Deal directions, and you can call them socialism, or you could call them Roosevelt and Norman Thomas. Norman Thomas wrote a pamphlet once during the New Depression saying the New Deal is not socialism.
Mm-hmm.
But for political reasons, I think.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Bernie defined it as socialism.
Right.
Okay.
It's more fixing
but
capitalism,
the
yeah.
The point is that while people disagreed about the solutions to the problem that the economy wasn't working for the average person, right? There was an implicit agreement on something that they never raised, and it was a value issue. It is, what would it mean for the economy to be working? In other words, what was the failure, okay? And the way they defined the failure either was that the system was rigged, right? Meaning that there wasn't really, equal opportunity. Some people had a head start and others didn't. Or they meant that, not only was it rigged, but basically some people were making out with all of the income growth. So that all of the income growth for the last, 5 decades, whatever, had gone to the top 1% or the top 10% or whatever. But the average person, the middle class, was hollowed out. The American dream no longer existed. Each generation used to be better than the one before. That was the value consensus, right? And what it had implicit in it were some value definitions, like what should we mean by progress? What should we mean by the American dream? What should be the purpose of an economy? And there was a broad consensus there, and it is the broad consensus right now of progressive politics in the United States. And it's what economists who work on international economics, I used to do that because I worked on poverty issues in the United States Institute for Agency for International Development for 10 years after I left the Hill. But it's what we used to call equitable growth. Mm-hmm. It's basically the idea that you have deliberate policies to ensure that as the pie gets bigger, it doesn't go to the top 1%, but everybody benefits from that. And a higher minimum wage is an example of a good equitable growth policy. But the point is that the definition of the American dream was, higher levels of income, going up the ladder, and progress was understood as occurring when everyone went to higher levels of income together. Okay, we reject that. That's what Roses is about. Roses is about saying that, hold it, there is bread, right? And bread means, satisfying basic needs, but there's also roses. And it's not only that roses is there, roses doesn't even come after bread. Roses comes with bread, right? And roses means things like meaning, and it means time and the leisure to do things that are really important, And so what we're saying is, and we pose this as a very explicit alternative definition of the American dream. And we said, we're proposing a new American dream, right? Which is not to have high levels of income, not to make it. We're proposing an American dream which says, have modest levels of income, moderate income, but have it be very secure, have it be sufficient to meet our basic needs, and then have enough time outside the job system so you can do passion work, whether you're paid for it or not, but that is work that's deeply connected to your identity, gives you meaning, gives you your real identity, is the answer that you give when somebody says, what do? You don't tell them what your 20 hours of job work is. Maybe it's in a supermarket, maybe it's at the cash register, maybe it's in the garment industry. That's your job system work, but who you are is you're an artist, or you're a poet, or you're running a radio show, whether you're making money for it or not, right? Yeah. Or you're an activist, or you're a revolutionary, or you're, a public attorney, or you're a student, or you're a scholar, or you're, 1,000 things that are deeply important to people that are outside the job system. So what we're talking about is an American dream that eliminates status that's related to how you make your income. It rather redefines people in terms of their passion work, which is how they spend the other 20 hours of their work week. So what we're talking about is something that's super radical. It's aiming at a cultural transformation that is much more what the 60s were about than progressive politics. And if you live through the 60s, what really hits you is, in many ways, how impoverished the political agenda is right now of the left. Mm-hmm. it left behind things that were so much a part of what we were talking about. In the 60s, before there were the teach-ins on the Vietnam War, there was a gigantic teach-in at Berkeley, and it was from something called the free speech movement, right? And it wasn't primarily about the war. It set the model for the anti-war stuff, but the free speech movement was about higher education. It was about colleges being interwoven as part of a corporate system of transmitting not just information from the schools to the corporate world as to who will do best, sorting people out for their jobs in the corporation, but it was basically training people to be cogs within that rather than to find their fulfillment in a totally different way of living. Well, that's what the 60s were about, more than the anti-war movement. And of course, it all blended together. But the politics that we have now on the left, it's all bread. And bread is very important. But there's, Emma Goldman said, this anarchist, she said, if I can't dance to it, it's not my revolution.
Hell
right?
yeah. Well, that's
And
a
when
great
those,
distinction. Yeah.
And when those women, the Bread and Roses slogan comes from this massive strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, which was the manufacturing for clothing center of the world, right? And they had these gigantic factories. They were filled with women workers, not solely women, but very greatly women workers. Some of them were children. Many of them were immigrants. They spoke about 14 different languages, right? And when they went on strike, at some point, the women took over the strike, and they marched with a banner that no one had ever seen workers march with before. And the banner was bread and roses too,
Mm-hmm.
And what we say is that when people talk about roses, in addition to bread, they're saying, yes, of course, we need to meet our basic economic needs. But we're about more than that. We're complex human beings who've got needs and maybe rights for beauty and for time and for meaning, right? And this is what we're about in 1912. At the very bottom, immigrants, women without the right to vote. And this is what we're about. So what we're saying is that it's over a century since then, and the left has gotten so impoverished that roses has dropped out. And here's an irony. I have a lot of respect for Elizabeth Warren, right? Elizabeth Warren, she's from Massachusetts, right? You know where she launched her campaign from? She went to Lawrence, Massachusetts, and
Wow.
launched her campaign from there and talked about the historic strike in 1912 and didn't mention roses. And for all of the things in her, I have a plan for everything, her whole social agenda, there's no plan in there for any dimension of roses. Where's the plan for meaning?
Yeah.
Where's the plan for, a 20-hour work week?
Well, yeah. Well,
And
Jerome,
so
that's
on. So
we're
this is
about out
what
of,
we're adding. And
yeah.
here's the thing, and this goes back to the very beginning, right? There's nothing that we're saying that cannot be part of what Democratic Party endorses.
Agreed.
And so Bread and Roses is bigger than the Bread and Roses Party, and it's bigger than my candidacy. Bread and Roses is a separate organization, and we have our own website, and people can join that website and still be in the Democratic Party, right? I was in the Democratic Party, and I ran a Bread and Roses campaign in 2018 for the US Senate inside the Democratic Party, challenging Ben Cardin. I ran domestically on a Bread and Roses agenda, and I was in that campaign over the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what brought me into it, and it's really, we haven't talked about that, but Israeli-Palestinian stuff is really what I've devoted most of the last 40 years of my activism to. And I started something called the Jewish Peace Lobby in 1989, which, to put it in perspective, was, 23 years before J Street came along, right? And we were for the two-state solution. And I was part of the first Jewish American delegation in 1987 to go to Tunis and open a dialogue with Yasser Arafat and the PLO.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's some great stuff on your website about that.
And so on. So the point is that I challenged Cardin primarily because Cardin became a hack for AIPAC and the Netanyahu government. And he became the primary person in the Senate. And he was, by the way, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at one point. And if the Democrats won the Senate, he was lined up to be the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Yeah.
And Cardin had become like the primary obstacle to dealing, for instance, with the expansion of West Bank settlements. So I challenged him. And my primary against him was the first time in American political history that anybody had ever challenged a sitting member of the Senate in a primary on this issue. It was always historic. Nobody had ever been faced a primary challenge coming from our point of view before, right? And I didn't even have to beat Cardin. All I had to do was demonstrate, that 20% of the voters in the Democratic Party in Maryland would vote against you for this. And you know what happened? Here's more of my critique of the left, right? There wasn't a progressive organization in the entire state of Maryland. Not just they ignored my campaign, they ignored the Senate campaign altogether. Nobody endorsed, there wasn't a progressive organization in the entire state of Maryland that endorsed anybody in that Senate campaign, because the left doesn't care about foreign policy or cares about it so selectively. It's pathetic. I mean, if you came out of an anti-war position, our revolution, right, which is a spinoff of Bernie, right, on the local level in Montgomery County, which I was part of, right, recommended that they endorse someone in that Senate. They didn't say endorse me. They said, get Cardin up here.
Well, the fact that the Democratic Party is so beholden to AIPAC, and like you said, Netanyahu government is part of the reason why so many people are fleeing the Democratic Party. And because
it's changing. It's changing.
It's kind of changing. But even let's be honest. Look how they treated, Ilhan Omar and the likes of her. No one in the House stood up for her, including Nancy Pelosi.
If you've been doing this, you see, the thing is, we're so different in age, right? So, I've got a 40-year memory of what it is to, so I went on the Hill when I started the Jewish Peace Lobby in 1989, right? And I had a resolution that had no connection to anything else, that simply called for, Israel to halt the building of settlements in the West Bank, the Palestinians to halt terrorism, and the Arab states to halt the boycott of Israel. Okay, so completely balanced, right? And I was told by one of the very good people on the Hill, if you can find 10 people in the House who will co-sponsor this, 9 people, I'll join you and be the 10th. I couldn't find 10 people who would co-sponsor that.
Well, there you go. Anyway,
that
Jerome,
was 40 years ago.
We got to go.
Today, you can find 100 people in the House who will talk about tying U.S. aid to Israel's policy on annexation in the West Bank. So things have changed a lot.
Things have changed a little bit, although it's a slow march. Well, anyway, thanks, Jerome. Thank you so much for joining me on the program today. I had a great conversation. I really love the vision of the bread and roses. I think you guys are doing such important work, especially with really emphasizing that roses part, because I think you're totally correct that a lot of the modern movement has left that out. So I look forward to speaking with you again, hopefully soon. And I really did want to talk more about the Israel-Palestine stuff. Like I said, unfortunately, we're out of time today, but I would absolutely love to have you back on to talk some more about that. Anyway, thank you so much, Jerome. It was a great conversation.
And fun talking to you.